So as Chris said, the title of the article that came out earlier this year and the presentation today is Economic Constraints on Children's Taste Formation and the True Cost of Healthy Eating. And this particular presentation comes from a larger research project that aims to understand the following questions. First, how do low-income and higher-income parents decide what to feed their children, especially in an age of increasing concern about dietary health and children's dietary health in particular? And more theoretically, I'm attempting to understand how do material constraints on the one hand and ideas that parents hold about food on the other interact to produce these decisions. The general background and motivation for this project and for today's presentation are that rates of diet-related chronic disease have risen over the last decades, and just as these conditions have become more prevalent, there are socioeconomic disparities in diet quality and dietary health, meaning that those who are least equipped to deal with these conditions are those who are most likely to have to do so. The question I'm going to pursue today is a subset of this broader project, and it's how do economic constraints faced by families shape opportunities for children's taste acquisition. In doing so, I'm going to focus in on the set of arguments about food choice that have to do with the cost of healthy eating. And in doing so, I'm not negating the importance of other considerations such as time scarcity, parental stress, cognitive bandwidth, or access. But I think there are important implications for these debates, and that's why I focus in on them. So on the one hand, there are researchers as well as food justice advocates who argue that healthy eating is simply cost prohibitive for people who live on a budget. And from this perspective, energy-dense, nutrient-poor foods like those shown here provide the most affordable dietary energy. The argument goes that low-income people are effectively rational actors, and they realize that they have to get a certain amount of sustenance, but have few resources to do so. And so they turn to the options that provide the greatest number of calories possible, leading them to choose options along these lines that can compromise their health in the long run. But there's actually some degree of disagreement about how affordable a healthy diet actually is. And on the other side of the debate, other researchers and food justice advocates argue that many healthier foods are indeed affordable. And they'll concede that yes, maybe it takes a little bit of extra planning and a little bit of extra deliberate budgeting, but that it's possible to improve one's diet on a budget. They allege that those in this camp actually overstate the cost of a healthy diet by focusing precisely on the cost of dietary energy. And folks in this camp argue that whether a healthy food is affordable depends in part on how cost is measured. So if we measure it instead by the cost of a serving of food or the weight of the food, some things that would be expensive on one metric become affordable. But despite this debate, and despite attention to the question of how food cost is measured, actors in both camps have overlooked a hidden cost of feeding children. And that's the cost of children's food rejections. Children are often neophobic, and this means that they're wary of unfamiliar foods. It's thought that this is an evolutionary adaptation to the fact that humans are omnivores. So as omnivores, we need a wide range of foods, but we actually have no inborn knowledge about what's poisonous and what's nourishing. So the idea is that initially children treat food with great skepticism and trepidation until they become familiar with it and they learn that it's safe. And this acceptance can take 8 to 15 exposures, where an exposure is defined as tasting the food. They don't actually have to swallow it, but they have to taste the food. In addition to this mechanism of repeated exposure, experience with a wide array of foods leads to a greater willingness to try unfamiliar items and the likelihood of acceptance. Now, in this process, children create waste. And it's specifically this waste I'm going to talk about today because it has implications for parents' purchasing patterns and for how we think about the cost of a healthy diet. For the broader project, I draw on a combination of in-depth interviews and grocery shopping observations. So I interviewed 73 primary caregivers. I interviewed some of them multiple times for a total of 81 interviews. I've actually done 6 or 7 additional interviews that weren't part of this paper, but the results are largely consistent with what was published. And in the grocery shopping observations, I followed 38 people. Again, I followed a couple people several times on a large and typical grocery shopping trip to see what happens when the rubber hits the road and what they do when the moment comes to decide what their family's going to eat for the next coming weeks. And after the shopping trip, during the shopping trip, they typically narrated their thought process. But I still sat down with them after the shopping trip to probe a little further what their thought process was and how they were feeling about the trip and some of the meal planning ideas they had for the food they had just purchased. I restricted the sample to whites and blacks and biracial parents who had at least one white or black parent. And I did that not because other groups are not of interest, but rather because I wanted to minimize the potential variation that was due to ethno-racial background or nationality. I did let the socioeconomic status vary to capture the interaction between families' economic resources and the ideas they had about food, and I oversampled low-income parents in particular because that's where I'm particularly interested in how families procure food. The cutoffs for these categories were 130% of the poverty line and below in the low-income group, 130 to 350 in the middle group, and 350% of the poverty line or higher in the high-income group. And just to give you an idea of what that means, a family with 2 adults and 2 children that makes $84,000 a year would be right on the cutoff of the middle and high group. And the middle group is a heterogeneous group. We can talk about that if you have questions, but for the purposes of this presentation, I focus mostly on the lower and higher income groups. So, I'm wrong computer. So the empirical argument that I'm going to lay out today is that children's taste aversion, what I called neophobia a few slides ago, leads to waste. And especially in low-income families, this concern about waste leads to avoidance of risk or aversion to risk in food purchasing. This tendency of low-income individuals to avoid potentially risky foods has been observed in other studies. I'm certainly not the first to notice this, but I see my paper as building on this observation in a couple of ways. First, I compare explicitly the tendencies of low-income and higher-income families. Second, I consider the implications of this risk aversion for children's taste acquisition and their food trajectories going forward, not just the implications for their present intake. I examine the moderators of parents' risk aversion, and I extend the findings to the debates about the cost of healthy eating that I discussed a few slides ago. So it became clear fairly early on that parents, low-income parents I talked to, were avoiding foods that their children might not like. So I asked Sharonda how she decides to buy food at the store. What food, of all the food in the store, is what ends up in her cart? And she responded this way: I have a bad habit of buying things that they eat a lot instead of trying different things because I don't know if they're going to like them. Here, her children's preferences are a primary criterion of food selection. And similarly, low-income parents reported cooking things that they knew their children would like for the meal and for leftovers. So Tamika, who prides herself on giving her children their favorites, told me that she does so for the following reason. She said, I know they're going to eat it, and if there's leftovers, I know that they'll have no problems with eating the leftovers. Here, the question of whether the food will get eaten or whether it will go to waste was a primary consideration. So why defer to children's preferences in this way? Well, when children eat their favorite foods, it makes them happy. And Tamika was glowing about giving her children their favorites, not just because it exhibited her tendency to be thrifty with scarce resources, but because it also put a smile on her children's face. Similarly, giving children what they like reduces time costs involved in food preparation and mealtime negotiation. And also on that note, it reduces interpersonal conflict around what children are going to eat. And these tendencies were shared across the socioeconomic spectrum in this sample. But one additional reason that was especially prevalent among the low-income subset of the sample was that giving children their favorite foods minimizes food cost. And that's because when children like a food, it minimizes waste. So I talked to Brittany, and she's food insecure. She skips meals at the end of the month. She sometimes goes a day without eating. And so I asked her in somewhat open-ended terms how she makes it all happen with the food part of it, and she responded in the following way. She said, "I get food stamps, but even then, because things are so expensive, you end up using your own money. So I get the things I know my son will eat and like. I try to mix it up a little bit, but I try not to buy the things I don't know if he'll like, because it's a waste." So the interesting thing here, she starts off by talking about the resources she has for procuring food and quickly pivots to talking about how she manages those scarce resources. And the first strategy for budget management she mentions is buying things that won't go to waste, because her budget has so little slack that she can't tolerate anything that would go in the trash. For women like Brittany, there's a very tight link between their children's preferences and economic risk. The economic scarcity faced by these parents puts real limits on experimenting with new foods. So this is Trisha. She's she's a poor African-American mother. She's actually living in a homeless shelter at the time. And she had great concerns about her daughter's idiosyncratic eating habits. Her 7-year-old daughter had recently announced that she was a vegetarian, for example. And at the end of the interview, I thought, well, I've heard this advice about picky eaters. Just try and let them experiment. And she referred back to a story she had told me earlier in the interview where her 7-year-old daughter, had begged her to buy couscous and swore up and down that she'd love it and hated it. And so Trisha said, yeah, let them experiment. That's what happened with the couscous. She tried it, didn't like it. It let her experiment on a budget. You know what I'm saying? Mommy, I want that. You're not going to get that because you don't know if you're going to like it. And if we get that, we're going to be going hungry for a couple days. So if you want an empty stomach, you go ahead and try. So for Trisha, there are real practical material constraints on the ability to expose her daughter to a wide range of things. She draws a zero-sum relationship between trying something new and simply not having enough food to fill their bellies. And although this threat of hunger may be somewhat hyperbolic, it's actually not clear just how hyperbolic it is. Trisha has $200 a month for food. She splits it half and half with her daughter, and in many cases doesn't have enough to go the rest of the month. And in drawing up these concerns about having an empty stomach, she nonetheless highlights a concern for parents who aren't necessarily facing completely empty cupboards, and that's that trying something new presents the risk of eroding a scarce household resource. Similarly, there are real economic limits on repeated exposure to new foods, this sort of 8 to 15 times idea. And I asked low-income parents what they thought about this recommendation, and they replied in a way similar to Brittany, who said, yeah, that's nice in theory, but for me, no. Because those whole 10 times that they say no, 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 you're wasting food. So that's a big thing for me. And like Trisha, Brittany was very concerned about her son. She thought he was underweight, he didn't eat vegetables, his diet consisted of mac and cheese and chicken nuggets and a few other items. And knowing her concern about his diet, I said, so if you knew that after 11 cauliflowers he would finally like cauliflower, would it be worth it? And she said, no, that's a lot of waste. No, not for me. So even a parent who recognizes the value of repeated introductions, and even one who very much desires to do that, this is an economic risk that's just beyond the bounds of their budget. So in short, parents defer to their children's preferences. They fall back on the things that they know their children like. And this phrase, I know, came up over and over. When they talked about doing it, they didn't just say, my son likes mac and cheese, or my daughter likes potatoes. They say, I know my son likes mac and cheese, and I know my daughter likes potatoes, thereby signaling this opposition between certainty in what's familiar and uncertainty in what's novel. Often, however, children like energy-dense, nutrient-poor foods. Some of the trade-offs or the sacrifices that parents mentioned were giving their children sweetened oatmeal packets instead of just plain oatmeal, Hot Pockets instead of homemade beans and rice, and mashed potatoes, mounds of mashed potatoes instead of collard greens, or avoiding classes of foods altogether, such as vegetables. Now, this risk aversion in low-income respondents wasn't uniform. It varied according to some conditions. And I'm going to talk today mostly about the moderating influence of family-level food preferences, the preferences of siblings, other parents, or sometimes boyfriends who lived with the mother. In essence, household-level food preferences define which foods present a risk for the family. And this is because when there are broad preferences in the house, a smaller range of foods present a risk. And we can see why this is the case in my conversation with Jackie, who's a low-income mother of 3. She was talking about what happens when there's food waste in her house. She said, my daughter will say, "Mommy, I don't want this." And it's a whole plate of food. So I asked, well, what do you do with that food? She said, well, I put it back with the other food or somebody else eats it. I don't waste food around here. No, like, are you kidding me? There's 5 of us, her 3 children, and her boyfriend. No money to waste. But my boyfriend, and I'm sorry, he's a garbage disposal. He'll eat anybody's leftovers. He's like a dog. So in the case of a house where some member will reliably eat the food that the child rejects, the link between children's taste and economic waste is attenuated. This kind of flexibility exists because these families can share their food with the children, offering small bites each time so that there's not that much plate waste and a larger amount of food doesn't have to be thrown away. And these family members can also absorb the food that the children reject. Now, it's important to note that absorbing food that children reject can lead to increased intake among adults, so this is sort of a double-edged sword on the second point. But from families' perspective, it leads to an attenuated relationship between children's tastes and economic risk. We can see this sort of flexibility in a family like Jackie's stands in contrast to the greater restriction in a family like Cassie's, where the parent herself has restricted budget and restricted tastes. Here, because of her limited preferences, there's more risk of waste. So Cassie describes herself as a plain Jane and talked about the antics she went through as a child to try to avoid eating healthy food, including literally throwing broccoli out the window. And so after that, I asked her, well, what do you do with your own daughter with foods she might not like? And Cassie just said, I don't buy a lot of those things. If I'm at someone's house and my daughter sees it and says, ooh, that looks good, then I might let her try it. But other than that, I don't really buy those things. So she kind of isn't getting what she should be. And I said, well, what holds you back from buying things like that? And Cassie says, the fact that I don't like it. So no doubt in the case of someone like Cassie, who has well-entrenched food preferences, part of the reason she doesn't buy that stuff is out of habit. But for her, too, buying something outside the range of her own tastes for her daughter's sake presents an economic risk. And this is evident because she talks about risk even in the case of foods where Cassie herself likes the item. So I asked her at another point in the interview, are there any things that your daughter doesn't eat for breakfast that you would like her to eat more of? And Cassie talks about some of her own favorites, bacon and eggs. She said, I can give her bacon and eggs, and I just feel as though it's a waste of money giving it to her because she'll just leave it there. So even for foods she likes, her daughter not eating them is an economic risk. Never mind the foods that she won't like. And so in these cases, if neither parent nor child likes the food, it's a double economic risk because that food may go to waste entirely. And it's families like Cassie's where the parents have restricted budgets and restricted palates, where they face the greatest economic pressure to fall back on their children's preferences. Another thing that encouraged parents to try something that had been previously unfamiliar to their children was when the children had tried food elsewhere. Parents talked about their kids trying celery sticks and carrot sticks, pomegranates, Asian pears, asparagus at a friend's house, cauliflower, Parmesan, ready-made that they had gotten from a food pantry, and tomatoes, which Cassie's daughter had incidentally tried at a cookout. So when parents knew that their children liked something because the children had tried this elsewhere, there was no longer any risk involved. And I'll note that some of these items are a little on the expensive side. Pomegranates, Asian pears, asparagus, kind of expensive foods. But the parents nonetheless bought these things occasionally, as opposed to not buying them ever without the knowledge that their child would eat them. The tendencies of low-income respondents stood in contrast to the greater willingness to take on a risk among the middle middle class / higher income parents I talked to. So Claudia was one such mother. She told me about how when the new Korean grocery store opened, she and her son got a dragon fruit, and they had no idea what a dragon fruit was, and it was $5, but like, why not try it? Wouldn't that be fun? So she said, I can take a chance on food that he might not like. He wanted a peach poppy seed salad, and I was like, okay, but I'm not sure you're gonna like it. And then he didn't like it. And I was like, I knew you wouldn't like it. But again, because we're lucky, we can do this. And not only did she buy something that he didn't like, she then subsequently went back and bought a pasta dish to replace it. For parents, cost was a less salient barrier to the advice to repeatedly introduce children to a new item. So I talked to Wendy, who wanted to find higher protein snacks for her daughter. And she had tried almonds a couple of times, and it didn't really go over very well because the almonds happened to be stale. And I asked her if she could see herself trying almonds 10 to 14 times, and she said yes, because almonds are very easy to put in a little Ziploc bag and take it with you. And I said, because she didn't mention waste at all, unlike Brittany, I said, well, would you be at all worried that if you did that like 10 to 14 times, it would be kind of a waste of money? And she said, well, I'd try to find a better storing solution so that they wouldn't get all rubbery and stale. But no, I don't think money would be a reason for me not to buy it. Here, the salience of economic barriers is much, much lower. This is not to say that middle class, upper income parents don't experience barriers and frustrations to feeding a family. Time scarcity, emotional strain, interpersonal conflict all come into play. And children's favorites are still an important part of feeding a family in these higher income households as well. I talked to Lorraine, who was one of the most adventurous eaters in the sample. When I went shopping with her, she purchased smoked mussels and pickled octopus that she had tried at a Spanish friend's house the previous week. And she was very excited about giving these items to her husband and children. But she was also very excited about the old standbys. And I said, what are you looking most forward to giving your boys? And she said, I'm always happy when I have certain easy go-to items in the house. They always make me feel complete, like I'm well-stocked and I can get things done quickly. And she's talking about relatively healthy, wholesome foods like canned beans and a cheese tortilla on a whole grain corn or tortilla, quesadilla, or things like tofu and frozen broccoli. But nonetheless, she sees great value in getting things done by deferring to her son's preferences at times as well. So as I've shared this argument with various audiences, one of the questions that's come up is, why not simply withhold the food from the children? Why not? We know that hungry children will not let themselves starve if there's a plate of food in front of them. So why not either require them to eat it or withhold the food altogether until they finally succumb to hunger? The first argument is that sounds appealing in practice, or in theory, and in practice it's not appealing at all, because hungry children are often difficult to deal with. They get tired, they get cranky, they get whiny, and when you're trying to get their homework done or get them to bed or just have peace of mind, the choice between serving that broccoli as cold breakfast or providing them mac and cheese probably comes out in favor of mac and cheese. Second, eating disliked foods under stress doesn't actually increase the liking of that food. This has been demonstrated in experimental psychology studies as well as qualitative work that your own faculty have done on people's food preferences. So if the long-term interest is not just to get food into children, but to develop habits and preferences that will carry out through the life course, the idea of withholding food until they succumb may not be the best strategy. Second, among the low-income parents I talked to, the idea of withholding food from children cut a little bit deeper. For low-income parents, having buffering children from hunger was a point of parental pride. For these parents, it couldn't always be taken for granted that there would be enough food. They lived in communities where neighbors sometimes knocked on the door asking for food because they had run out. There were parents who sometimes skipped meals themselves, but they prided themselves on never having to subject their children to that experience. And suggesting as a policy implication that we withhold support from parents until they start withholding support or food from their children seems to be slightly impractical and I would argue slightly heartless as well. Second, a handful of low-income parents reported to me concern about state intervention in their children, in their families' lives if they had hungry children on their hands. So Stephanie was talking to me about exposing her son to things that he didn't like, and said one time he didn't like tomato juice. And she said, you know what, that's fine. And she explained why. So I don't want to force him. See, I was forced to do this when I was a kid. It's either you ate it or you didn't eat it, and that was it. Now forget about it. You do that, they're like, I'm calling the police. I'm calling Child Protective Services. From this perspective, low-income people's lives are often very entrenched in the state bureaucracies that make their survival possible. And in doing so, they become subject to surveillance that the rest of us normally don't have to endure. And the state is not necessarily a benevolent provider. It's often a potential threatening surveillance system, at least from the perspective of these parents. So when faced with the prospect of a child going to school and saying quite innocently, I'm hungry because my mom didn't give me dinner last night, the cost-benefit calculation falls on the side of Hot Pockets rather than having a Child Protective Services agent knocking on the door. There are some important scope conditions and caveats to this argument that I'm laying out. One is that risk aversion born of economic scarcity may not be the most immediate barrier to healthy eating, or more specifically to feeding children a healthy diet. Other beliefs and attitudes may be the most proximate influences. So, for example, I talked to a low-income woman about why she had purchased on the grocery shopping trip Teddy Grahams, chips, and Twinkies for her 1.5-year-old daughter, who at the time was 37 pounds. And she first said, well, this is survival food. The idea of sort of being, we're in a crisis situation in it was a motel that the state had rented. We're currently in a shelter. This is survival food. And when I said, well, you know, you do have a mini fridge. What do you think about carrot sticks? She said, well, carrot sticks are just nasty. Like, why would I give my daughter something that's just nasty? I wouldn't want to eat it. Why would I subject her to that experience? So here there's a belief that, an arguably erroneous belief that her personal preferences reflect the inherent characteristics of the food that her daughter then naturally would also perceive. In cases like this, other beliefs and attitudes of her personal food system may be the most effective targets for dietary change, although I'll note that even in cases like this particular woman, where the proximate cause is a certain construction of food, there's nonetheless a fundamental barrier to experimentation and repeated introduction that would remain. So I think these findings have implications for several areas. The first is for children's health. Without repeated exposure to varied foods, children may not come to like options that aren't inherently palatable. And often it's those things that aren't inherently palatable that happen to be conducive to good health. Second is that preferences formed in childhood tend to track over time, or at least they set us on a certain food trajectory. And so these early experiences may have implications for long-term health outcomes. And risk aversion, to the extent that it's unequally distributed across social class, may contribute to socioeconomic disparities in dietary health and diet quality down the road. The implications I'm going to dwell on the most are those for food cost estimates that I mentioned earlier on. So in most food cost estimates, food waste goes unobserved. There's sort of an implied overlap between what's purchased and what's consumed. And in part, that's probably because there are certain data limitations. Often these studies use data, individual food intake data. So that often it's a 24-hour dietary recall. So the analysts have at their disposal what the person ate and in what quantity. They then link these data to food price data and do calculations more or less along these lines. Food cost equals the quantity consumed times the price of that food. And there are adjustments for things like the water that's lost when you cook a steak, or the oil that's absorbed when you fry a potato, or chicken bones and such. But ultimately, the analysis is basically a function of the amount of food and the price of that food. So for example, if let's say, like, take this apple. I actually weighed this apple at home. It weighs 1/3 of a pound. It's $1.50. So if we were to consume this half apple, it would cost, and this apple costs 50 cents. The estimated cost of eating half an apple is 50 cents times half an apple for a total of 25 cents. It seems pretty straightforward. This half an apple costs 25 cents. But for parents, waste isn't unobserved. In fact, it's quite salient. And that's because parents pay for what's consumed and for what's wasted. So that means that from their perspective, their subjective calculation is that food cost equals the quantity consumed and the quantity wasted times the price. So in a world where a child is still rejecting new foods, if they consume half the apple and they waste half an apple, the cost of an apple incorporates the cost of the apple that's eaten and the half that's wasted, for a total of 50 cents. So in a world of waste, a half an apple costs 50 cents, not 25 cents, like in the world where we only calculate the cost of the part that's consumed. So in essence, when children are wasting food, the cost of the food provided exceeds the part of the food that is consumed. And this has some broader implications for how we think about calculating food cost. One is that the same food, this half an apple, can have different costs depending on how much is wasted. 25 cents for a whole, or 50 cents. Sorry, 25 cents for half an apple, or 50 cents for half an apple. It also means that different foods with similar prices may have different costs. So the honey bun on one of the earlier slides, that honey bun image is out of date. Honey buns now cost 50 cents. So you can have a half an apple for 25 cents, a whole apple for 50 cents, or a honey bun for 50 cents. If you're weighing between half an apple for 50 cents and a honey bun for 50 cents, you might go with the honey bun. This also means that foods that look affordable on paper can become costly in practice. So often you'll hear, meals on a shoestring for $3.50 for a family of 4. That assumes that food is getting eaten. Yes, that food may cost $3.50 for a dinner for a family of 4, supposing that the people in the household like beans and rice, or that they like cabbage and caramelized onions mixed in with their spaghetti. And finally, more generally, we know that social context shapes food choice in many ways. What I think these findings show is that social context also shapes assessment of food cost itself. So cost isn't just a function of the price on the tag, it's also a function of the social dynamics in the household. This means that at the end of the day, the healthy as possible argument overestimates the ability to provide a healthy diet because it doesn't account for waste. And it means that the healthy as prohibitive argument may be overstated in some ways, but it may be accurate, although for an unanticipated reason. Now, there are some scope conditions to this argument, too, about cost. Some foods are just expensive, no matter how little the waste and no matter how we measure cost. Parents talked about foods that they couldn't afford to give their children because it would cause too much waste, but they also talked about foods that their children already liked and that were too expensive to prepare or to purchase on a regular basis. Things like fresh seafood, cherries and berries, sushi, Asian pears, quinoa, homemade Chinese American food. They'd buy these things occasionally, or in some cases for the really constrained parents, not at all. I think there are also some important implications for policy and programming. The first ones are at the level of individual families. First, pediatric feeding advice to repeatedly introduce children to a wide array of food should acknowledge risk aversion among economically constrained families. And certainly there are practitioners who do recognize this. But for those who don't, it's worth bearing in mind that when some parents hear this advice, they think that's a risk I can't take. One strategy for working with this risk aversion is to identify foods that create less waste by virtue of the characteristics of the food itself. So for me, frozen fruits and vegetables come to mind because they have a relatively long shelf life for those who have a functioning freezer, and not everyone does. But for those who do, there's a fairly long shelf life, and the foods can be divided into small portions, which means that parents and other caregivers can offer small amounts each time without creating a lot of plate waste and without having to throw away a larger unit of food, as you might have to do in the case of something that's more perishable. Another idea is to create positive emotions around other dimensions of the eating experience. Fear and trepidation and skepticism are one dimension of eating and food for children, but there are others as well, and those could be important intervention points. Some ideas that are well established are to involve children in cooking and gardening. That gives them kind of an inside look at what goes on behind the scenes in a way that can attenuate their skepticism, and it can create a sense of emotional investment in the food. Another idea is to create appealing, engaging presentations, food that's fun, food that's cute. Certainly there are limitations to these recommendations, especially in the second set of recommendations. It involves extra parental labor, extra parental mental space. You might even have to buy some little cookie cutters to cut out bell peppers. That may be something not everyone's actually up for. But these are some sort of ideas about ways that could be mobilized to address this issue. At the level of organizations beyond the family, I think it's important to distribute risk across organizations. Schools, after-school programs, daycares, religious organizations, perhaps even organizations such as the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. Again, there's been a lot of work around school food, preschool food, and that's because experiential food education increases children's willingness to try food and to accept it. So in arguing for this kind of policy intervention, I'm not so much proposing something new as I am joining in the chorus of people who already acknowledge the importance of these endeavors. One thing that the interviews I did do suggest is that parents are quite willing to purchase foods for their children that the kids have tried at home. So there might be some important school-to-home spillover effects. I do have to say that it's not clear if these spillover effects then reach family members themselves, and so the potential of children's in-school experiences to modify the other family members' eating habits is kind of an open question. There are no doubt limitations to the study I did. The first have to do with the breadth and representativeness of the sample. This was a relatively small sample, at least compared to large-scale survey studies, and it was limited to 2 ethno-racial groups in one location of the country. So I can't speak to the prevalence of this phenomenon in other groups or at the population level. Similarly, I can't establish what the magnitude of the effect of risk aversion is relative to other barriers to making healthy choices, such as time scarcity, access, cooking knowledge, and so on. And finally, I don't quantify just how much food cost estimates would change with the inclusion of waste. I show that because of how it's calculated, typically any omission of waste will lead to a biased estimate, but this estimate would probably vary by food type, by the child's age, by the household composition, by the package size of the food that it was purchased in, the perishability of the food, and so on. So there are nonetheless issues that still need to be addressed. I hope, though, that in doing this research, I've shed light on an understudied mechanism of food choice, and that I've drawn out some of the implications such that these questions can be pursued in greater detail and with different methods, with the ultimate goal that we'll gain some greater insight into how to improve the diets of our children. Thank you.